Russia says at least 3 people have been killed in a massive Ukrainian drone attack on the Moscow region overnight in what appears to be Kyiv's largest drone attack on Russia since the start of the war. The attacks come as U.S. and Ukrainian officials are holding high-level face-to-face talks in Saudi Arabia this morning that's aimed at bringing an end to the conflict. I want to bring in Michael Bociurkiw. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and joins me now to talk about this. So, Michael, I watched an interview that my colleague Tony DeCopel did with Senator Mark Kelly, who, as you know, just visited Ukraine. He came back. He put his points out on social media. Elon Musk called him a traitor. What Senator Kelly told my colleague Tony is that what Ukraine simply wants are security guarantees. They may even realize that some of the territory that's been lost, specifically in Crimea, they're not going to get back. But without any security guarantees, it's tough for them to make a deal. So are they likely to get that?
Good to be with you. Well, the signals coming out of Jeddah right now are pretty positive from both sides. They say progress is being made, but I would actually be very surprised if we got to the stage where that rare earth minerals deal is signed, the one Mr. Trump seems to really want, as well as what Ukraine is asking for, which is, of course, security guarantees, but also it wants, for the time being, a ceasefire in the air and on the sea. But I think we're in a situation where, Russia in previous talks seemed to have been getting a lot of concessions, whereas for Ukraine and the United States, it's all very extractive. Not only does Mr. Trump want those minerals, but also he's paused military aid, USAID aid, and intelligence sharing. So it's very, very lopsided. I think if this continues, that Trump peace train for the Ukrainians will be coming to an end. And maybe, just maybe, they'll want to look for another interlocutor trusted by Russia, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or one of the other Gulf states.
Right. So ahead of today's meeting, as you know, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said both Ukraine and Russia will have to make concessions. You've already outlined what concessions the Ukrainians would have to make. Have you heard anything that's been reported on what kind of concessions Russia would have to make?
Well, I mean, they've actually not had to. They didn't have to make any concessions in order, for example, to get restrictions on diplomatic properties in the United States lifted. You're going to start seeing a lot of Russian diplomats coming back to the United States. Probably a lot of them KGB operatives. But Russia has so far given out signals that they're not willing to come to the negotiating table with full sincerity for peace. They've already written off this Ukrainian proposal for a temporary ceasefire in the air and on the seas. So it doesn't look good. And, that massive, unprecedented drone strike you referred to overnight in Russia, including Moscow, that was Ukraine saying to them 2 things. Number 1, we're going to bring this war to your doorsteps. And number 2, we actually do have cards to play with. And perfectly timed, I think, for Russia to feel some pressure to come to the negotiating table and offer something in return.
Michael, before you go, could the United Kingdom, France, other NATO allies provide that security guarantee if the United States was unwilling to do so?
Maybe down the road, but for the moment, there's been years and years of neglect, not only in Europe and the United Kingdom, but also my home country of Canada. And you can't simply flip the switch and all of a sudden there's tanks and jet aircraft and other things willing to go to Ukraine. They can fill some of the gaps, apparently, in terms of intelligence, which is what Ukraine needs, and also humanitarian aid. Ukraine has a $3.5 billion a month budget deficit, so it needs access to those frozen Russian assets, most of them in Europe, to help pay the bills here, pensions and stuff like that. One more quick thing. I am in Moldova. This is a frontier country between Western Europe and Ukraine. A lot of anxiety here about possibly Mr. Putin exploiting this void that has been created by the U.S. temporary withdrawal of aid and coming up to the borders of the country, if not further.
Well, and that's an excellent point you make as we end our discussion, simply because if there are if Russians are not held to account for their past transgressions, what would they worry about an incursion into Moldova, which is obviously much, much smaller than Ukraine and perhaps would not be able to put up the resistance the Ukrainians have been able to do. But to your other point, perhaps it is time then, and the president has suggested this as well, that Europeans take a stronger interest in, I know they've upped their defense spending over the last decade, but perhaps take the lead in protecting their continent and as the United States seeks to isolate themselves from situations like the one we're in right now. Michael Bociurkiw, a really, really interesting discussion. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.